Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter. Hi there guys, it's Martyn here, and welcome back to another video, and today we're going to be talking about how Eurovision 2025 may not be that big of a contest as we may hope. The Eurovision we've just had, Eurovision 2024, had 37 nations who decided to enter and participate, and now whilst this has been the lowest for quite some time, when you look at the last 20 years, ever since they really started introducing the semi-finals, we've hovered between, like, say, 35, 36 to a peak of about 42, 43 countries. So anywhere within that ballpark now, I'd say people would readily accept as like a standard, you know, a good amount of countries taking part. But for various reasons, there seems to be a reason to believe that we may have more nations dropping out for 2025. And if that's the case, how this could negatively impact the contest beyond that. At the time of recording, around 15 nations have either confirmed or implied that they'll be taking part in 2025, and naturally more of the obvious ones, say the United Kingdom included, that tends to get confirmed a bit later on down the line. But let's go through some members of the EBU, that's the European Broadcasting Union, the body that puts this on, and let's see what we've got so far as to why they might not take part. We're going to start with the members who aren't currently active in Eurovision, so these are countries that didn't take part this year, and in some cases haven't taken part for quite some time. The first of these is Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, they haven't taken part since 2016, they've been in constant financial debts and troubles with the EBU. Although their broadcaster did outline that they think it's high time to consider the possibility of returning to Eurovision in 2025. Now, obviously for this to happen, they're going to have to settle something with the EBU, whether that's somehow a clearing of debts or removing of sanctions or something like that. But again, they haven't taken part in nearly a decade, and they still broadcast the contest, so in theory the interest is still there for them to compete. But as to whether they will next year, personally, with the circumstances they've got, I don't think it's that likely. Next up is Montenegro, who didn't take part in 2023 or 2024. Now, in early January of 2024, their broadcaster confirmed that there was a public debate in December of last year concerning plans for 2024, and it said it plans to organise a music festival to promote Montenegrin artists and authors, which would depend on the budget be used as a way to select the representative for Eurovision 2025. So it seems like, again, they have a willingness, it seems, to come back. Obviously, they're looking on the financial budget. They don't want to end in the same space as Bosnia and Herzegovina does. But it seems like the willingness for Montenegro to come back is there. And I certainly hope they do, because they've produced some of my favourite entries over the years. Lest we forget Euro Nero.
Euro, don't be skeptic, hermetic, pathetic, analphabetic, forget old cosmetic, you need new poetic, aesthetic.
We've had a direct confirmation of non-participation from an EBU member, and that is, perhaps unsurprisingly, Slovakia. Slovakia haven't taken part since 2012, so it's been well over a decade, and in the April of this year, a representative from their broadcaster said it isn't going to come back in 2025 due to budget cuts. Now, some have speculated there are other reasons towards this as well. You know, Slovakia didn't necessarily take part all that much in Eurovision, even back in the 90s, nearly 2000s. But budget cuts are a shame, and I think this is the reality a lot of, particularly the smaller nations, are feeling right now, the squeeze, because Eurovision ain't cheap. You know, the participation fee required, getting artists over there, setting them up. One country that directly ties into that, actually, is Moldova, which is indeed one of the smallest nations to compete in Eurovision, and every year since they first joined, they have taken part, which is great, but it is well known that sometimes their own artists are funding themselves to the contest. I believe that was the case this year with Natalia Barbu, who is the Moldovan representative. I believe she did fund herself over there, which is great she was able to do that, but you know, if your broadcaster isn't in a position to even send you over, that's a bit of a worrying start, don't you think? We've got some countries who aren't currently members of the EBU but are hoping to be. One of them is Liechtenstein, which said in May this year that its radio broadcaster, Radio Liechtenstein, was in the process of seeking membership with the aim to debut in Eurovision. Now, is that going to be next year? I really doubt it. You know, for a radio broadcaster, not even a television one, that might be tricky just in terms of financials. Liechtenstein is tiny, you know, a really tiny part of the world. So whilst they may become members, in terms of joining for next year, I just don't see it happening. Another example of this is Kosovo, which is trying to gain non-EBU status and has actually requested them for an invitation to partake in Eurovision 2025. Now, again, as to whether this will happen, I don't know how likely this is. Kosovo is in a very tricky place internationally in terms of, its recognition. It's certainly not recognized by Serbia. So in terms of a 2025 debut, membership of the EBU possibly, but debuting next year, I don't know. I'm sadly not hopeful. Of course, there are several other nations who have taken part in Eurovision and haven't yet expressed what they're doing in the future, say Bulgaria or Hungary, North Macedonia, Romania. So we can hope that maybe some of those come out of the woodwork and announce their participation for next year as well. But at the time I'm recording this, we don't really have that information yet. Now let's talk about some of the countries who are EBU members, who frequently participate in Eurovision, but their status as to coming back next year seems a little on the fence. The first of these I want to touch on is San Marino, which, like Moldova, is a tiny... Well, I mean, San Marino's a micronation to begin with, but it is the smallest entrant in the Eurovision Song Contest. And their qualification rate hasn't been the best, over there. They've only qualified a small handful of times, 3 or 4 times, in fact. And this year, 2024, they didn't qualify either. And the San Marino's broadcaster has a 2-year agreement to host the current national final format, but that expires after the 2025 contest next year. And following their failure to qualify in the final for 2024, Secretary of State for Tourism, Federico Pedini Amati, suggested a possible withdrawal. Now, if you've got a government minister, the Secretary of State for Tourism no less, suggesting that you take yourself out of it, that's not a good sign. I mean, they're saying they've got this agreement to host the current national final format until after the 2025 contest. So, they are, I guess you could say, more than likely to take part in 2025 because of that alone. But beyond 2025, particularly say if they don't qualify next year, if they don't do well generally, then we could see San Marino bow out once and for all, which would be a shame. I think it's a shame when most nations decide to withdraw for, a whole number of reasons. But yeah, San Marino would be a real shame if they dipped. An interesting one is Norway. Now, the head of the Norwegian delegation stated in June of this year that they do intend to participate in 2025, but its participation would depend on the actions the EBU would take to ensure that they don't face another season filled with polarization, politics, and security concerns. And obviously, I think we're all aware of what they mean by that. This year's contest was blighted for several reasons. Several things were overshadowing it. Of course, millions still had a good time. I had a good time being there, then watching it on the telly. It was great, but I would be lying if I didn't say there was a particular dark cloud hovering over the entire Eurovision season this year. And Norway, their delegation, their artists, their broadcaster were particularly vocal. They were one of the most vocal ones in terms of, I guess, calling out that this was going on and the shortcomings of the EBU in several circumstances. So it's no surprise to me that they are now sort of, hinting that, well, we will come back, but if things haven't improved, if things haven't changed, then we're out of here. Obviously, as a Eurovision fan, I hope they don't dip. Norway has one of the most culturally interesting track records when it comes to Eurovision entries. I mean, this year I think they absolutely got robbed. They didn't deserve last place, yet another last place for Norway. But I think to lose them in Eurovision would be a huge shame. But again, they're saying they want to participate, but as long as the EBU has taken the measures to adapt, we'll see if that's happened. The next interesting one that I've mentioned a few times before now is Czechia. So shortly after Eurovision ended this year, the head of press, or the assistant of the head of press, revealed that a decision on Czech participation in 2025 was indeed made on the 10th of May, which was the day before the final, and it would be ratified and announced after August. Now, we all know that Czechia sadly didn't qualify this year. I did like the song Pedestal. It was decent. I don't think it should have qualified anyway. That's just my personal taste. But it seems the day after not qualifying, the broadcasters, the delegations got together and they decided what they're going to do for next year. Now, it is important to stress, whilst as doom-laden as this sounds, this isn't direct confirmation that they aren't taking part. The decision may very well have been, let's take part, but maybe we'll change our national final format or our selection process. So hopefully Czechia will take part in 2025. We're going to find out at the end of August, but I know a lot of people from this announcement, particularly the fact that, Czechia sadly don't have the best qualification record since they joined back in the mid-2000s. And their non-qualification this year in a particularly turbulent year a lot of people think their decision was almost instant. They thought, well, you know what? For 2025 at least, we aren't going to come back. I hope they do, but we'll have to wait and see. And one of the final ones I want to touch on that was a bit of a surprise to me was Latvia. Now, Latvia have a decent history in Eurovision. Of course, they did win the contest back in 2002, so they have form as one of the countries to win. The track record the past 10 years hasn't been the best. You know, they haven't been able to qualify for the grand final since 2016, although Dons was able to do it this year for Latvia, which was a great surprise to many, including himself. I don't think I'm out of order for saying that. It was a bit of a surprise. But we like Dons. He seems like a great guy. And even though the song didn't really do it for me, it was one of my lowest on my ranking. But, you know, people seem to like it enough, and that's great. But it seems Latvia have got other ideas. Apparently, a large amount of citizens are calling for the country's removal from the contest. It's going to be discussed in the Parliament of Latvia even, following a citizens' initiative. In detail, more than 11,300 signatures of Latvian citizens were collected on the Mana Balss platform in favour of Latvia's withdrawal from Eurovision and the allocation of money to sports. And since this was signed by more than 10,000 citizens, it has to be discussed in the legislative body of the Republic of Latvia. And the author of this initiative, the guy who spearheaded this, said, "I call for Latvia's participation in Eurovision to be terminated. It is doubtful whether this event significantly contributes to the image and reputation of Latvia. People who participate there tend to behave obscenely, and this is also stated as the norm. There are European countries that do not participate in Eurovision for various reasons, including financial reasons, and Latvia should better invest in its already problematic public funding where we have clear benefits in sports. Therefore, I urge you to end Latvia's participation in Eurovision, not to hold Supernova, which I'm guessing is the national final selection, and to redirect funding towards sports. It's unacceptable for the Biathlon Federation to have to collect donations for the World Championship, which is definitely more important than Eurovision." I must admit, I didn't know that their Biathlon Federation had to collect donations at all. That is quite a surprise. And, you know, in terms of investing in local or national sports for your country, I'm not saying that's inherently a bad thing. I think sports deserves to have, you know, to thrive and have investment just the same as arts-based events do, and that's coming from an arts-based performer, someone who's not really into sports. I think both of them need just as much healthy investment and time dedicated. Some of these comments, though, people tend to behave obscenely. I mean, it's not really clear what they're mentioning here. Do they mean, you know, do they class, say, Ireland's entry as obscene this year, because I know a few other nations did? Or are they referring to potential, you know, the allegations leveled at Joost Klein from the Netherlands? Is that what they class as obscene? Or is it just that the general state of Eurovision they class as obscene? You know, there are some nations out there, I'm not suggesting Latvia is, but there are some nations out there who have a sort of, you know, rising or bubbling under anti-LGBT sentiment, and we know Eurovision is a particular safe haven for that community. So, again, I'm not saying that Latvia is anti-LGBT as a nation, but again, this wording, behave obscenely, and it's stated as the norm. There's different interpretations you can take with that. Is it the way things are staged? Is it the behavior of contestants as individuals? Is it, you know, more than that? We don't really know, but it is a very odd wording, I'll give you that. As to whether this will happen, well, we'll have to wait and see. You know, if it's going to be discussed in the legislative body of the Republic of Latvia, then obviously it's going to have this scrutiny applied to it. I think for any nation applying to Eurovision, I guess like with any major event like this, there's the pros and cons. The immediate cons is obviously the financial aspect, the fact that these smaller nations have to invest a significant amount of money into taking part, and there's not even necessarily much financial reward in that. But, you know, I think the positives are you're getting your artist there on an international stage. I've fallen in love with tons of international artists that I never would have heard or be exposed to otherwise if it hadn't been for Eurovision. And I think for the music industry as a whole, that is so important now more than ever. Ultimately with this one, though, it is up to Latvia to decide. If they do withdraw, I think that would be a huge shame. It'd be a bit of a surprise, to be honest, for me, but hopefully they'll stay in. Come on, Dons, work your magic on them. I think I also have to touch on the Netherlands. Now, we've done a whole video about the situation with Joost Klein and where the updates were at and all that sort of stuff. So if you haven't seen that, go and check that out. You can find out some more information there. But Avrotros, the broadcaster for the Netherlands, you know, have sort of again hinted, sort of like Norway, sort of implying like we do want to come back, but we want structural and significant change at the EBU before we commit to doing that. So Again, it depends how the EBU is willing to bend to that, how the EBU is willing to adapt for the contest next year in Switzerland. They've been sort of silent on, you know, what they're going to do. There is the chance they could just carry on business as usual, nothing really changes, and if that happens, that's when we might see nations like Norway, like the Netherlands say, well, you know what, if you aren't willing to listen or adapt or change, then we're gone, which I think would be a huge loss. As I discussed in the other video, the Netherlands in particular is one of the bigger financial contributors to the contest. And if they go, then again, the participation fee raises for all the other nations, which might then create a domino effect of those smaller nations we talked about, like San Marino, like Moldova, etc., withdrawing as well. The crux of all this is people predicting that Switzerland 2025 next year could see the least amount of participants in over 20 years. And if that record is sadly achieved, then again, it's a great shame. But I think really, no matter how many participants take part, the spirit of Eurovision needs to live on. And so long as the contest goes ahead in one way, shape or another, and the appropriate actions are taken by the EBU and so on, then we should be okay. I hope this sort of dropping out of nations isn't a trend that's going to continue for years to come. I hope this is just sort of a temporary thing. But as we've discussed, there's loads. It's the three fundamentals again. It's the social situation, the political, and the economical that could affect nations taking part in the contest. But what about you? What do you think about all of this? Do you think the nations I've mentioned today are likely to drop out, or do you think they're going to stay in? Do you think a lot of it is bluster, you know, calling bluff sort of thing? And also, if there was a country I didn't mention that I think might drop out, let me know in the comments which one and why you think they're going to drop out. Let me know all of that in the comments down below. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like on it. It really helps us out. And subscribe to us as well if you're brand new. We'd love to have you aboard here with us. In the meantime, I've been Adam Martyn from AMTV. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Ethan Carberry-Holt, Bruce Danton, Derek Chambers, Sean Knock, Dord Khan, Liam Domain, Trev Hughes, Deck, Evan Hart 41, Jen, Tim Ripley, Mr. Eurovision 1986, Ted Elliott, John Wakefield, and Marnan L. Thurman, our AMTV staff members.